On June 27, 2000, a teenager went missing in Warren, Massachusetts. It was a lifeguard who was supposed to be working at Cumins Pond. Molly Bish went to work that day. It was her 8th day as a lifeguard. She drove with her mom to work. She stopped at a convenience store and purchased a bottle of water. She went to the police station, secured a police radio, then drove the short distance down to Cumins Pond. Her mom dropped her off, and everything seemed fine. Shortly after Molly was dropped off, beachgoers arrived and she was not there. What was left behind told a troubling story. Her chair, radio, flip-flops, and a bottle of water. It was all right there. By the time authorities told Maggie Bish that Molly had been missing for 3 hours, panic had already set in. Her brother ran into the water. He was trying to get to the deep end. He was just going on adrenaline. It was his baby sister. Fireboats came in. Dive teams came in. The state police helicopter hovered from above. Cadets from the state police were doing grid searches throughout the town in the woods. They were stopping cars. Was it an abduction? Did she drown? Did she walk away? The family was frantic. They stared into the pond like it would resurrect her or tell them what happened, like it had the answers they did not have. They had to sleep not knowing where she was for the first time in their life. The months went by, the years went by, then the decades went by. Heather Bish became a warrior. Ever since that day, she had been trying to find the person who took her sister. She picked up that sword and started marching on. To the man responsible for the abduction of Molly Bish, she wanted him to know she was coming for him. She would never give up. Maybe they would not know why, but they at least deserved to know who. She would use science. She would use technology. She would use her voice. She would not stop screaming from the mountaintops for justice for Molly. In 2021, 2 decades after her sister went missing, Heather Bish did something she never thought she would do. She got into the TikTok game. It allowed her to share her story and share Molly's story and really just be honest. It had been 7,680 days since her sister disappeared, and she had been waiting for answers on what happened to her. She hoped that by going public with her TikTok videos online, she would generate tips that would finally solve her sister's case and put an end to a painful 25-year-old mystery. If someone knew something, they needed to say something. The wait needed to be over. The last time Heather saw her little sister Molly was the morning of June 27th, 2000, just before Molly left for her job as a lifeguard at Cumins Pond in Warren, Massachusetts. Molly was playing with Heather's 11-month-old daughter, Michaela. She was having fun with Michaela. Her mom said they had to go. Molly was going to be late. But shortly after Molly was dropped off, beachgoers arrived and she was not there. By the time they told Maggie Bish that Molly had been missing for 3 hours, her mom was frantic on the phone. She said Molly was not there. Her shoes were there. Heather's heart dropped. She just knew something was wrong because she knew Molly would not go anywhere without her shoes on. Molly did not like icky feet. When they first heard that she was missing, they did not think maybe she had gone off with friends. That was not what they did. It was not their character. They were raised better than that. 16-year-old Molly was Maggie and John Bish's third and youngest child. She was heavily involved in school, with sports with her friends. Molly was an honor roll student, varsity athlete, and she had just completed her junior year of high school. Molly was just very loud and fun. Despite their 6-year age difference, Heather and Molly were extremely close. It was a bond Heather had had with Molly ever since the day she was born. Heather remembered thinking that baby was her baby too. She was going to teach her everything she knew, and they were going to do this life together. Molly also had a close relationship with her brother. She very much wanted to be like him. He took her underneath his wing. He was a lifeguard before her. She wanted to be a lifeguard. They played soccer together, baseball together. Molly was 5'7". She was athletic and in shape and strong. So when authorities suggested that Molly could have drowned, they did not believe it. When Molly went missing, it was inconceivable. The first aid kit was open. Adding to the mystery, the police radio was there. But Molly had not used it for her required morning check-in. Later that afternoon, when it became clear to local authorities that Molly had not just walked off with friends, state police took over the investigation and launched an extensive search. Detectives zeroed in on everyone who was close to Molly, including family members, friends, and Molly's boyfriend, Stephen Lucas. They had only been dating for 3 months and had just gone to the prom together. What raised some suspicion was that Stephen Lucas had a fat lip and he had some scratches on him. Could a young kid pull off this crime in such a short amount of time? The Bishes never believed that Stephen was involved. Within 24 hours, authorities were looking at known sex offenders in the area. That was the scariest part about all this, realizing how many bad people were within the fabric of their community. Molly's dad worked tirelessly with the authorities. He was always going every weekend trying to work with them and trying to find different ways to find Molly. And despite the fact that DNA testing was still in its early stages back in 2000, anything that was not there by nature was at least identified as potential evidence. As the days went by, the vicious despair grew. It was not like Molly was hit by a car or got sick. She was just suddenly gone, and they did not know where she was. But it would be Maggie Bish who would give detectives their biggest lead. The morning before Molly disappeared, as Maggie went to drop Molly off at work at Cumins Pond, she recalled seeing a man sitting alone in a white car. She saw this guy, and he was just smoking a cigarette, and he just gave her a little look. She said she could not leave her there. The mama bear came out. Maggie waited for 20 minutes until they finally left. When she brought it up with Molly that evening, Molly did not seem concerned. She said it was just a fisherman. She was not afraid. The next day, when Molly disappeared, Maggie told authorities about what she had seen. That became very significant because now they had a piece of information. A sketch was composed based on Maggie's description, and it was released to the public. Maggie had seen the hair. It was gray. It was very thick. There was the smoking. That was what she remembered. Almost immediately, hundreds of tips started flooding in. If someone was a 50-year-old white male with a mustache and salt and pepper hair, somebody wanted to give a call. When time kept going and passing, everyone knew it was not good. Someone either had her, and that was horrendous. Then, almost 3 years after Molly disappeared, authorities were notified that a bathing suit had been found in the woods just 5 miles from Cumins Pond. It was the first major break in this case in years, and a very anxious time for Molly's parents. 3 years after Molly Bish disappeared, Dr. Anne Marie Myers, a forensic anthropologist for the Boston Medical Examiner's Office, was summoned by authorities to the area known as Whiskey Hill, located about 5 miles from Cumins Pond. A local hunter had stumbled upon pieces of a weather-beaten blue bathing suit, much like the one that Molly Bish was wearing when she disappeared. When Dr. Mayers saw the bathing suit, she said it had probably been up there for roughly 3 years. It was covered by deadfall, leaves and debris from 3 years of foliage dropping, but then it had also grown into the surface and roots had come up through it. A reporter arrived with her photographer and was let in. What was going through her head? She was sick to her stomach just thinking about Maggie and John and knowing what it could mean. As the reporter left Whiskey Hill, she called Maggie. Maggie asked if she could show them the video. The reporter really did not want to do that, but if that was what Maggie wanted to do, she wanted to do whatever she could to help. Maggie had a little van with 6 little TV inside, and the reporter showed it to them. It looked so distinctive. It looked like Molly and Maggie knew that was her right then and there. Maggie went up and locked herself in the room. She cried so hard. There was nothing. She was gut-wrenched. It was one of the toughest days for those who had followed the case because for 3 years there was still hope, and Maggie knew at that moment that something was drastically wrong and something horrible had happened. Investigators sent the bathing suit to the Massachusetts State Police Lab and a private lab in Virginia for DNA testing. As they waited for DNA results under Dr. Mayer's instruction, a new search was launched. Anyone who had compasses worked off 110 as 110 magnetic field. They did grid searching arm to arm. They were within sight of each other. They combed the forest with rakes. Had any of that area been searched before? No. When John Bish arrived to the scene, Dr. Mayers assured him of one thing. She looked him straight in the face and shook his hand and said if his daughter's remains were there, they were going to bring her home to him. DNA results came back as inconclusive. The search continued and intensified, and it was the biggest search that had ever been conducted in Massachusetts history. Almost 2 weeks later, they made a horrific discovery. They discovered a human bone. It was the upper arm bone. It was described as the bone of a person between 14 and 20 years of age. As days went by, investigators would come to find more human bones. It was like every day they came with small rib bones. It was agonizing, and they were trying to find Molly. The family went out every morning. They thanked the searchers. They were so grateful that people would continue to look and help them find Molly. By the end of the 3-week search, investigators found as many as 27 bones and a human skull spread across 35 acres of forest. It was confirmed through DNA testing and dental identification that the bones were Molly's. Dr. Mayers believed that Molly's killer most likely picked Whiskey Hill because of its hidden location. It was possible the killer might have been a hunter, been that familiar with the area. Dr. Mayers also believed that after Molly was killed, a mountain lion may have scattered her remains among the 35 acres of forest. She often felt that the person knew the area and knew that there was a large animal up there. The depth of their sadness was something no family should have to endure. With the discovery of her sister's remains, Heather had a hard time accepting the tragic news. She wanted to run away. She just wanted to run outside of this nightmare and this life and maybe even her own body. But she remembered feeling like she wanted to run away immensely. The search for Molly Bish was now over, but the search for her killer was never more urgent. 2 months after Molly Bish's bones were discovered in August of 2003, on what would have been her 20th birthday, Molly was laid to rest. They were so blessed that they got to have it in a church. But after 3 years, the Bishes still had no answers as to who could have murdered Molly. And the man in the white car who Maggie had seen the day before Molly disappeared had never been identified. Frustrating was a recurring word in this case. Maggie was not the only one who reported seeing a suspicious white car in the vicinity. On the day that Molly went missing, a white car was spotted at a car wash right down the street from the pond, and again in the cemetery behind the pond. So somebody saw a white car on the road. The thought was that if somebody brought the car down there, they could maybe grab her, pull her back up, get in the car before anyone noticed. That was a theory. In fact, in the early days of the investigation, search dogs did follow Molly's scent from the pond leading up to the cemetery. Someone did not just stumble upon Cumins Pond. That was why the person who killed Molly Bish had to have watched her, and they had to have had a plan. But there were still so many unanswered questions like why was the first aid kit left open? The belief was that Molly's abductor may have pretended to be injured, and then someone either forced her or threatened her to get her up that hill because she was athletic. She was not going to go easily. Then, in May of 2004, 4 years after Molly disappeared, a grand jury was convened. Whenever anyone heard about a grand jury in a criminal case, they thought there was evidence against someone, so the hope was that the case was moving forward. Heather, along with her family, were called to testify. Many of the questions seemed to be focused on Molly's friends. They were all kind of mad because they did not feel like they were really significant. But detectives had learned that some of Molly's friends had gathered at her boyfriend Stephen Lucas's house the morning of Molly's disappearance. They were telling authorities conflicting stories about what happened in the hours before and after Molly went missing. The grand jury transcripts were sealed, so it was not known whom the investigators actually questioned, but they would later clear Stephen Lucas as a person of interest. After 2 long years, in December of 2006, the grand jury was dismissed without an indictment. It was disappointing. It was incredibly disappointing. Just weeks after the grand jury was dismissed, a new district attorney took over. He said the grand jury was used as an investigative tool to preserve witness testimony. They got them right in. They got them under oath, and there was a criminal penalty if they lied in the grand jury. And they could not say later they did not say that because it was right there. That was something that helped get cases beyond a reasonable doubt and prove guilt. But Heather said not having answers as to who murdered her sister was taking its toll. She was giving up hope in a lot of areas. And things only got worse. In 2007, her father, John Bish, who worked so closely with authorities, had a stroke. Heather would now face the daunting task to take over where her father had left off. And it would not be easy. Authorities kept saying they were just one piece of information away. Well, where was that piece? In 2008, a man who resembled the sketch named Rodney Stanganger was arrested for murdering his girlfriend in Florida. The victim's sister reached out to Heather and claimed that Stanganger may have been involved in Molly's murder as well. He had this violent history. He lived very close to where Molly trained to be a lifeguard. He was also a smoker. He was known to fish at Cumins Pond and hunt in the area where Molly was found. Authorities were notified about this tip, but Heather was told that Stanganger had been on one of the investigators' lists of persons of interest from the very beginning. One investigator had actually visited him in prison. Stanganger did not have much to say, but they attempted and other investigators did as well. Stanganger was convicted of murdering his girlfriend and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. In 2012, state police went down to Florida again to search Stanganger's trailer. They did execute a search warrant at his residence with their law enforcement partners, and they did take items. The items were tested for DNA to see if they could be connected to Molly. They tested and continued to test and moved forward. But there was not enough evidence to make him an official suspect. Then, in 2011, a private investigator came to Heather with a new tip about a man named Gerald Battistone. He had actually raped a woman in the woods where Molly was found. See? His ex-wife had a white car that she reported he was driving in Warren the day Molly disappeared. Heather took this tip to the state police, who confirmed that Battistone, who died in prison in 2014, was on their radar along with many others. There were times someone could say this person was really good for this, and this person was really good for that. But that was not how to solve a crime. Evidence had to support it. Finally, in 2021, 21 years after Molly disappeared, it looked like investigators had enough evidence. The district attorney's office officially named a person of interest. For the first time, Heather thought this was it. There would be justice. On June 3, 2021, more than 2 decades after Molly Bish disappeared, there was finally news. There was a break in the murder of Molly Bish. More than 20 years after the teenager was killed, investigators named a new person of interest. They had never done that before, but they did get more information to come in. They pursued those leads, and at that point, they were comfortable saying this person was a person of interest. Francis Sumner Sr. was a local auto repair shop owner with an extensive criminal record. Frank Sumner seemed like a great suspect. Frank Sumner had a violent past. He was convicted of rape and kidnapping. He was familiar with the area. He was from the area. He had access to a white car. And when comparing the photo of him smoking a cigarette to the sketch, there was a resemblance there. And just like the sketch, Sumner was photographed smoking with his left hand. Sumner, who died in 2016, had been well known to investigators working the Bish case for years. Information came in, some dots were connected. Although tight-lipped about the details, the district attorney's office was confident that Sumner was a viable suspect and planned to compare his DNA to DNA found at the crime scenes. But as it turned out, they could not obtain Sumner's DNA. Sumner had been cremated, and his DNA had never been submitted to the national database. Somebody dropped the ball. So authorities traveled to Ohio to get DNA from his son, Frank Sumner Jr., who was serving time in prison for robbery. They waited and waited because they said they were going to do some DNA analysis. Heather, who had started that TikTok months earlier, reached out to her followers to see if she could drum up more evidence. If someone knew something, if they heard something, they needed to call the state police tip line. They were still waiting for answers. Heather said it took investigators about a year before they finally told her the results of the DNA testing. It was inconclusive. What did that mean? Was he eliminated from the DNA? Heather did not know what that meant, and they would not tell her. Heather wondered if authorities who collected discarded cigarettes and other evidence at Cumins Pond even had a viable sample of the killer's DNA. Did they have enough DNA that they could do genetic genealogy? Had they done any? They could not speak to the DNA. They continued to test and had gotten well over 100 pieces of information tested and continued to test. The Bishes had been frustrated. They did not feel they were getting enough information. They wanted to know, was the DNA being preserved properly? What kind of DNA? As a general rule of thumb, no matter what family it was, the Bishes or other families that they had, they just did not share the information because someone might say something they should not say, and it could compromise the entire case. However, DNA was just one piece of the puzzle. This was not just a DNA case. There was a lot of investigation that had been done. They needed a little bit more. They were not going to say what it was, but they needed a little bit more to get to where they wanted to get to name a person as the defendant in this case. But Heather said she was losing faith in the investigators. It was really a sad situation to be a victim family member in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. One investigator said he understood Heather's frustration. Heather was a fierce advocate for her sister and her family, and he would not have it any other way. And he had no problem being held accountable by Heather, and he was happy that she held him accountable. 25 years after Molly Bish's murder, the case remained active, and there was a new detective who had recently joined the investigation. She had a plan, and she dedicated herself to something. She did not stop until it was accomplished. In March of 2025, Detective Chelsea Safford was hired to take over the Bish investigation. It was a perfect job for someone that had an overactive mind, thrived on challenges, and did not sleep much. One of her first tasks had been to weed through and organize over 80 boxes of case files that had accumulated over the years. She saw all those boxes and just wanted to dive in. She just wanted to learn more. Detective Safford believed the answer to who killed Molly may just lie within these 80 boxes. She found Molly's high school yearbook and went through that. She had a few tips that she was trying to track down. It was part of her strategy to organize and look at past tips with fresh eyes. Who else might have heard or seen something that they did not realize was significant? That one person they had not spoken to might be the missing piece that they had been searching for this entire time. She believed that one more piece was out there. She just had to keep digging. Detective Safford faced an overwhelming task. There had been almost 8,000 tips that had come in since Molly went missing, and they kept coming. Since she had been in this office, she did not think a week had gone by where they had not received a Molly Bish tip, if not multiple throughout the weeks. Detective Safford also studied the many pieces of evidence involved in Molly's case. She accompanied a reporter to the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab's DNA cold storage facility in Sudbury, Massachusetts. Inside some brown paper bags were items taken from the crime scenes. The swimsuit was there. It had been sent out for additional testing. There were a lot of cigarettes, containers. They had been repackaged over time. They had been tested. Detective Safford was going to be looking at this to see if there was something else. She was thinking, why not try to test that? Today, Detective Safford had her eye on one piece of evidence in particular, Molly's backpack. That was the number one item she had been looking for. What someone carried in their backpack or pocketbook said a lot. Learning about the person, the victim, was a very important part of each case. Despite the challenges, Detective Safford was determined to find answers for the Bish family. None of them could bring Molly back, but the best thing she could do was find out what happened. She had some solved, guilty, captured. Was that what she wanted to do in this case? It was not what she wanted to do. It was what she was going to do. Yes, they would do it. Heather Bish, who had been critical of the Massachusetts State Police investigation in the past, said she was encouraged by Detective Safford's passion. She felt like Detective Safford had the same energy and commitment to solving this as she did. Heather still made TikTok videos about Molly's case, hoping her efforts would one day generate a tip that could help investigators. Somebody knew something and somebody knew who killed Molly Bish. She would never give up. She would fight. Molly deserved that. Justice. The district attorney insisted that investigators were moving in the right direction. As he sat there, was Frank Sumner still on the top of the list of people of interest? He was the only person of interest they had named. The only person of interest that had been named in this case. On June 27, 2025, the Bish family gathered with friends and family to remember Molly 25 years after her death. First at the cemetery and then at a more formal ceremony in the center of Warren, Heather felt Molly beside her. Because of Molly, she had become braver than she ever thought possible. She had faced her deepest fears. She had endured unimaginable heartbreak. She had survived. She believed Molly's love and light had guided them through these 25 years. So today they shared their family's gratitude. And because of Molly, they had conquered what evil could not. For love was much stronger. The evening ended with a gathering at Cumins Pond. Heather did not want people to ever forget Molly, and they would never stop honoring her.